The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the Manfromleng. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, we are going to delve too deep into Hunter's Armor, one of 4 customizable cards that Fantasy Flight Games spoiled at the end of June in their preview article for the Scarlet Keys Investigator Expansion. The customizable keyword gives players unprecedented control over the cost, stats, and abilities of their cards, some of which may have up to 9 different effects that can be purchased for 1 to 5 XP. We've got a lot to talk about, so let's dive right in. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the patrons of this channel for their tremendous support. The Arkham Horror LCG community is amazing, and these people have gone above and beyond to bring you content like these previews. Speaking of amazing members of the community, Los Archivos de Arkham are the latest patrons to embrace the darkness. Los Archivos de Arkham are prolific content creators in their own right, and I am thrilled to have their support. Whether you're a native Spanish speaker or you need a little help from Google Translate, I highly recommend that you head over to archivosarkham.com to check out their contributions to this community. Thank you very much, Los Archivos de Arkham, for your support as well as your content. It is greatly appreciated. If you'd like to be amazing like Los Archivos de Arkham and support the channel's goals and see your name on this list, head over to patreon.com, sign up for a tier of your choice, and claim your rewards. That would be awesome. Special thanks to Coleman Rochity for the amazing art that graces the channel, Nicole Fiscus for the Whisper in Darkness logo that I used for the podcast, and Nate Lost in Time and Space for the intro as well as the overlays. Thank you very much, I couldn't do it without you. Without further ado, let's get started. Hello Arkham Horror fans, welcome back to the channel. As you are all well aware by now, Fantasy Flight Games unveiled the Scarlet Keys Investigator Expansion at the end of June. In addition to 6 new investigators, the box will contain a plethora of new player cards that will expand our deck building options. Some of those cards will feature the new Customizable keyword. The preview spoiled 4 cards with the Customizable keyword: Hunter's Armor, Runic Axe, Summon Servitor, and Power Word. However, the preview article neglected to include the rules for this new keyword, and the Arkham Horror LCG community was more than happy to fill in the void with rampant speculation. Fortunately, designer MJ Newman released the rules for the customizable keyword on Twitter shortly thereafter, putting the speculation to rest and giving players a chance to properly evaluate player cards with the customizable keyword. If you're unfamiliar with the rules for the customizable keyword, check out my recent In the Know video about them first. I'll leave a link to it in the description down below. When the preview for the Scarlet Keys Investigator Expansion was released, I had planned to tackle all 4 customizable cards in one video. However, after taking a couple of stabs at recording that video over the past couple weeks, I've decided to look at the cards one by one. Discussing a card with a half dozen or more abilities that you can mix and match depending on your strategy requires a little more time and thought than I expected, and I hope that you'll find the information presented here helpful in evaluating future customizable cards, some of which have already been spoiled by other content creators in the community. The first card we're going to take a look at is Hunter's Armor. It's a 4-cost, non-unique Guardian asset with 1 willpower skill icon and the item and armor traits. It has the customizable keyword 2 health, 2 sanity, and it requires a body slot. There isn't a great deal of competition for the body slot at level 0 in any of the 5 classes. The only Guardian card that requires a body slot is Bandolier from the Dunwich Legacy Investigator Expansion. There are also a couple of neutral options, Fine Clothes, which was also recently released in the Dunwich Legacy Investigator Expansion, and Heavy Furs, which came out in the Edge of the Earth Investigator Expansion. Guardians with a Rogue or Survivor off-class, such as Leo Anderson or Tommy Muldoon respectively, can pick up Leather Jacket from the Winifred Havemock Starter Deck product, or Leather Coat from the revised core set. While Hunter Armor 0 doesn't have a lot of competition for the body slot, it's worth noting that all the other options are considerably cheaper than it, with most of them topping out at 2 resources. Hunter's Armor is unique in that it's a level 0 card that can soak 2 damage and 2 horror, but you are spending a lot, and I mean a lot of resources for that soak. Compare it to Fine Clothes, for example. If you pick up Fine Clothes, for 1 resource you get 1 health, 1 sanity, and a fairly good, albeit situational ability to reduce the difficulty of parlay tests by 2. Resources can be tight in Guardian, and many investigators in that class prioritize allies and weapons above all else. Hunter's Armor 0 is neither of those, which puts it closer to a nice-to-have luxury rather than a need-to-have staple. Besides, if you need more soak, playing another copy of an ally usually solves the problem and advances your game plan at the same time. That begs the question whether there is a quote-unquote customizable tax tacked onto the resource cost of Hunter's Armor level 0. You're not spending 4 resources because Hunter's Armor 0 has a great ability at level 0. You're spending 4 resources because Hunter's Armor has the potential to do so much more once you spend a few XP to upgrade it. Hunter's Armor seems like the most flagrant example of this tax on a level 0 card. I haven't really noticed it on some of the other customizable cards that have been spoiled recently, but it's something to keep in mind as more customizable cards are revealed leading up to the release of the Scarlet Keys Investigator Expansion later this year. So if you're spending a bunch of extra resources on Hunter's Armor 0 for the customizable keyword, let's take a look at the 7 upgrades, which cost between 1 and 3 XP. First up is Enchanted. If you purchase it for 1 XP, Hunter's Armor gains the Relic trait and takes up an arcane slot instead of a body slot. If Hunter's Armor gains the Relic trait, it becomes an option for Ursula Downs, and that's about it. Relic simply isn't as valuable on armor as it is on weapons, at least for now. Ursula can spend up to a total of 8 XP on Hunter's Armor as long as she buys Enchanted first, but I don't believe there will be many Ursula decks that are interested in that option. Ursula tends to rely on a host of allies to soak damage and horror for her as she races through scenarios at a breakneck pace, and none of the upgrades on Hunter's Armor really support that strategy. Given the power of some of the other upgrades available to Ursula in the Seeker card pool, I suspect the majority of Ursula decks will take a pass on Hunter's Armor. The other ability on Enchanted dumps Hunter's Armor into the arcane slot rather than the body slot. As I mentioned earlier, there isn't that much competition for the body slot, and most of the cards available simply provide more soak, which seems a little redundant if you're planning to upgrade Hunter's Armor in the first place. More on that in a moment. Come to think of it, there isn't that much competition for the arcane slot in most Guardians either. Enchanted Blade and Brand of Cthulhu are probably the most noteworthy cards that require an arcane slot, but Flesh Ward, Rite of Sanctification, Shield of Faith 2, Enchanted Armor 2, and Spiritual Resolve 5 are also in the mix. Unless you are a Guardian/Mystic Investigator, it seems like you'd be swapping one slot that you were probably not going to use for another slot that you probably weren't going to use. However, I could see an Investigator purchasing Enchanted if they needed to play Hunter's Armor in conjunction with, say, Bandolier to free up their hand slots, or Fine Clothes if they were desperate to parlay during scenarios. Who knows, perhaps we'll see a few more cards in the Scarlet Keys that will incentivize a Guardian to swap slots, but for now at least, Enchanted seems like a pretty low priority. The second upgrade on Hunter's Armor is Protective Runes, which costs 2 XP. Hunter's Armor may be assigned damage and or horror dealt to other investigators at your location. If you're playing multiplayer and your team includes a few squishy investigators who have taken some trauma along the way, the ability to assign damage and or horror to Hunter's Armor could be useful, especially if you spend extra XP to boost the armor's health and or sanity. I should mention, however, that there are a handful of Guardian cards that already have this ability, notably Tetsuo Mori, Something Worth Fighting For, and True Grit at level 0, and Brother Xavier at level 1. As someone who plays solo most of the time, the value of this upgrade is a little difficult to judge. I like the fact that Protective Runes is an option, but it's probably not the first upgrade that I'm purchasing either. Depending on the composition of your group, you may not need it at all. Protective Runes seems like a low priority, at least early during a campaign. The next 2 upgrades, Durable and Hallowed, both cost 2 XP and give Hunter's Armor +2 health and +2 sanity, respectively. There are very few cards in the game that sport either 4 health or 4 sanity, and I believe Agency Backup level 5 is the only card with both. If you spend 4 XP to purchase Durable and Hallowed, you've almost got another Investigator's worth of health and sanity at your disposal. Spend another 2 XP on Protective Runes, and you've almost got another Investigator's worth of health and sanity that can soak damage and or horror for anybody at your location. If you're looking for extra soak for the team, Hunter's Armor has got you covered. Ultimately, your decision to purchase Durable and or Hallowed depends on the campaign and or scenarios that you expect to face. On one hand, if you're knee-deep in enemies or the encounter deck is spitting out a lot of treacheries like Grasping Hands, Durable makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, if treacheries like Rotting Remains are the biggest threat, go for Hallowed. If you're playing a scenario like Union and Disillusion from the Circle Undone, you may want to consider picking up both. I don't think it's absolutely necessary that you purchase either of these upgrades, but it's nice to know that you've got the option to shore up your health or sanity if the campaign goes south, or you want to leverage an ability like Armor of Thorns, which we'll look at in a moment. The final 2 XP upgrade is Lightweight. Hunter's Armor gets -1 cost and playing it does not provoke attacks of opportunity. I'm not a big fan of spending 4 resources on Hunter's Armor level 0, so Lightweight alleviates my concerns about that cost somewhat. The fact that playing it does not provoke attacks of opportunity is also a great perk. Sometimes you get jumped by an enemy before you're ready, or you end up engaged with an enemy that may attack you but you're running low on soak. Lightweight comes in handy in both of those situations. Honestly, I kinda wish this upgrade had been incorporated into Hunter's Armor level 0, or it cost 1 XP to give players an option besides Enchanted. I really like this upgrade, but I could also see myself skipping it to focus on other priorities, or to keep the total XP cost of Hunter's Armor down. Still, it's hard to argue with a cheaper version of Hunter's Armor that you can play without provoking attacks of opportunity. That brings us to the first of 2 3 XP upgrades, HEXDRINKER. After 1 or more damage or horror is assigned to Hunter's Armor from a treachery effect, you may exhaust it to draw 1 card. There aren't that many options to draw additional cards in the Guardian card pool, so every bit of draw helps you dig that much deeper into your deck that much faster. Treacheries that deal damage or horror are fairly common, including Grasping Hands, Hunting Shadow, Rotting Remains, and On Wings of Darkness from the revised core set. Drawing cards is great. Unfortunately, you don't have much control over when HEXDRINKER will proc. In multiplayer, cards like Let Me Handle This or First Watch can tip the odds of drawing a treachery that deals damage and or horror in your favor. There is also the matter of failing the skill test, which are common on these types of treacheries. There are a couple of hoops that you've got to jump through to trigger HEXDRINKER, but I think the ability is pretty good. Is it 3 XP good? That depends on how often you're able to trigger it. The final 3 XP upgrade is Armor of Thorns. After 1 or more damage or horror is assigned to Hunter's Armor from an enemy attack, you may exhaust it to deal 1 damage to the enemy. I believe this type of ability is available on only 1 other card in the game, that being Guard Dog from the revised core, and that card only reflects damage, not damage and horror. You may trigger Guard Dog 3 times before it runs off to the discard pile. Hunter Armor does the same for 3 XP. If you're willing to spend an extra 2 to 4 XP, you can squeeze 7 triggers out of Hunter's Armor. I really like Armor of Thorns. Guard Dog is a great card. Unfortunately, it does require an ally slot, and competition for that slot is very fierce. Armor of Thorns gives investigators another way to include a Guard Dog-like effect in their deck without tying up their ally slot. I really wish I could play Hunter's Armor with Armor of Thorns in my Daniela Reyes deck, but alas, she can't take it because she's limited to Guardian level 0 cards. One upgrade that is missing from all of the customizable cards that have been spoiled thus far is the option to upgrade the skill icons. When you upgrade or purchase a traditional player card, you usually get an extra skill icon or 2 to help you pass skill tests, which usually get a little more difficult as the campaign progresses. Now, I don't know whether the lack of extra icons is important in the grand scheme of things, but it may become relevant toward the end of a campaign as skill tests get more difficult, or if you're playing on harder expert difficulty. If I've got a copy of my souped up Hunter's Armor on the table and I've got the other copy in my hand, I'm probably going to commit it to a willpower skill test. It sure would be nice if it had 2 or 3 willpower skill icons rather than 1, but I guess that's the price we pay for the flexibility of the customizable keyword. If you're really worried about the lack of skill icons on customizable cards, the easiest way to work around it is just to play more skill cards. Again, I don't know whether the inability to upgrade skill icons is that important, but it does raise some interesting questions about how much XP you're paying for those icons on traditional player cards. One of the biggest advantages of customizable cards is that you get to add 1 or more copies of them to your deck as long as you purchase 1 upgrade. However, the XP cost of the upgrades appears to be balanced around the fact that you get 2+ copies. While discussing the upgrades available for Hunter's Armor level 0, I've been assuming that you want to include 2 copies in your deck. But what if you only want 1? Hunter's Armor does kinda seem like the type of card that may warrant only 1 copy. In that case, I think you're really risking paying too much XP, depending on the upgrade. It's kind of like Hunter's Armor gains the exceptional keyword if you're only playing 1 copy. Ask yourself, is 1 copy of Hunter's Armor with Durable and Hallowed really worth 4 XP when the math suggests it's actually closer to 2? At that point, I would probably start looking at other cards available. For example, for 2 XP, you could pick up 1 copy of Protective Gear, which has extra health, sanity, and a bonus perk, or Enchanted Armor, which is much cheaper and has the potential to soak a lot of damage in horror, if you can pass the skill test. Determining the value of an upgrade like Armor of Thorns is a more challenging exercise. I think I'd be prepared to spend 3 XP for that upgrade because it's a better version of an ability that is available on only one other card in the game. Would I be willing to spend 7 to 9 XP for Armor of Thorns and some combination of Protective Runes, Durable, Hallowed, and Lightweight? That seems kind of unlikely. Ultimately, I think you'll have to decide whether 1 copy of a customizable card is worth it on a case-by-case basis. In the case of Hunter's Armor, I'm not convinced that it is. That's going to do it for my look at Hunter's Armor. Some of the upgrades available for it are what we've come to expect to see on Guardian cards. More health, more sanity, the ability to assign damage and or horror dealt to other investigators. Others, like Lightweight, HEXDRINKER, and Armor of Thorns, are either unavailable on other cards or are exceptionally rare. The biggest difference here is that you get to pick and choose which of those upgrades that best suit your strategy. I don't know exactly how much XP I would be willing to spend upgrading Hunter's Armor level 0, but I think it's somewhere between 5 and 7. Armor of Thorns plus Lightweight, and with the option to pick up Durable or Hallowed depending on the campaign, seems like a solid plan. Unfortunately, there is only one 1 XP upgrade, which means you're probably going to have to choose between spending 5 or 7 XP, and 7 seems like a little bit too much to me. How much would you be willing to spend upgrading Hunter's Armor, and which upgrades would you choose? Let me know in the comments down below. That's going to do it for this episode. If you enjoyed what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.